Hello and welcome to your video on primal, tribal, and indigenous cultures. I've got lots to show, so I'm trying to give myself a little more screen room this time, but the first thing I want to say is that I will probably only call these tribal and indigenous cultures in part because the term primal is sometimes taken to mean primitive, so it can sometimes be seen in a very negative manner, and I certainly do not want that. The second thing is that when we deal with these cultures, we are dealing with worldwide cultures. So the indigenous cultures are as unique as each tribe they represent. And remember that these tribes are going to be in Africa, South America, Japan, India, Russia, Canada, Africa, right? They're all over the world, the island nations even to a certain extent. So ultimately what we're dealing with is similarities between these different indigenous cultures. So the first thing that I do want to talk about is that most of them do hail from an oral origin, meaning these are spoken religions. Now, it's not that the indigenous cultures could not write or could not record stories, but there's a couple different reasons to keep these to an oral level. The first thing is, what do you do when you tell a story? Well, you literally suck in a breath, right? What is it that you do when you're born? What's a sign of life? Sucking in a breath and then screaming your head off. Pretty much that's how it goes for the rest of your life until the end, in which ultimately you do that final exhalation, right? That death rattle. So from the time you breathe in until you had that final death rattle, that is a single breath, if you think about it, in and out. As long as you're breathing in and out, you're alive. Well, when you tell stories, you are connecting these stories back to that life force. Secondly, humans have a rather remarkable vocabulary. While animals can communicate with one another, they don't necessarily have a language like we do, and so language is something that kind of becomes one of our very powerful tools. Unlike animals, we are not built with claws. I mean, these are, manicured, right? We don't come with poison skin. We don't see as well in the dark. Our sense of smell is nowhere near as great as a rodent or a canine. So we don't have those attributes, but what we do have is communication and the ability to reason, to recognize and to reason. And so that becomes a fairly important part of these indigenous cultures. So as we move forward, orality connects us to our humanness. The third part of an oral tradition is that it makes us intergenerational. So you have the elders who tell these stories to the other generations, your parents perhaps, who will become the next elders, and their children who will become the next set of parents. And so this orality keeps you intergenerationalized. It keeps you connected to that tribe. A second mark of this particular religion or type of religion is actually the tribe. So the tribe produces the clan or your family unit, and your clan produces your family unit, and your family unit produces you. And so really it is the tribe that through a series produces the individual. The individual cannot live without the tribe. And I've always found this interesting because in a way we are a giant world tribe, even today. If you are not generating your own electricity, weaving your own clothes, growing your own wheat and grain, and milking the cows for your breakfast, then really we are dependent upon others to help us. We don't see ourselves as interconnected as we really are. Well, the interconnectedness not only extends to the tribe, but also extends to nature. So your mother consumes the food of the earth, which basically allows you to grow. You consume the food of the earth, which allows you to grow. And then ultimately you die, returning to the earth. So the concept of sacred nature, it's called animism. Everything in nature has a soul or spirit. If you think about it, trees grow from little tiny seeds, right, or an acorn like an oak tree, into these magnificent things that you would never guess come from these little tiny things. But trees also live, mature, they communicate, they grow, but they also age and die. And then they return to the earth. If you think about a river starts with a stream, a little creek, and then it carves its way into the earth, and it grows from a creek into a stream, and from a stream into a river, right? And so it's forever growing, but over time, right, those water sources can dry up, and the river can return to the stream, and the stream can return to the creek, and then the river can die entirely, leaving behind just the earth of a riverbed. And then we return to dust. So there's a certain element to nature that ages. There's a certain element that references us, right? Like us, nature changes. Like us, nature is born. Like us, nature dies. Nature also is our sustainer, which means we don't have to look into an abstracted figure to find Godhead. Godhead is in nature. And we know that Godhead is happy because nature is happy and we're eating and the tribe is doing well. But if nature is not happy, that means that Godhead is not happy because we're not eating and the tribe is not doing well. And so you actually have that direct correlation between nature and the tribe. The interconnectedness of us to nature, nature to us, me to my family, to my clan, to my tribe to my clan, to my family, to me. Okay? And my puggle, who's being very naughty. There you go. There's also concepts within primal, tribal, and indigenous cultures that include sacred space. So space is kind of like a concept, like the concept of New York City. We imagine what it is, the state of New York City in New York, New York, right? It's populous, it's built up, it's energetic, it's alive, it's always moving, right? It's a city that doesn't sleep. But there's also physical place. So you drive to New York, New York, and there are streets, and there are physical buildings, and there are sewers, and there are physical locations. So the concept of New York, which is kind of a trendy, artsy, active, alive, busy city. And then the place of New York, that is cities and the streets and the sewers and the buildings and the concrete jungle that it is. Well, the tribe has a similar idea. You have the forest, the idea of the forest, and then you have the physicality of the forest, right? Okay. So let's see. We talked about tribe and clan. Okay, good. We talked about interconnectedness. Good. Look at that. Moving right through these instructor notes. There's also an element of fear or awe of the dead. Now, I always love this because I've got lots of show and tell tonight. What I have brought with me, this is a spirit rattle. It is used to contact the spirits. I actually had a National Endowment Grant of the Humanities, and I went to New Mexico to study Georgia O'Keeffe and promptly got altitude sickness, so that's fun. But I got this there. It is documented as part of the tribe member, so it is an authentic item going to the tribe. But what they have said is, according to some Indian traditions, the original rattle was a gift from the spirits. Therefore, the object of the rattle is to invoke the spirits. Rattles were considered sacred objects and were many times symbolically painted to be employed in rituals, religious festivals, and by medicine men or shaman in healing rituals. They were fashioned from animal hoofs, horns, turtle shells, and rawhide, differing somewhat in shape, size, and ornamentation, depending on the tribe or individual maker. Some rattles were handheld, which while others were used to actually be worn. So there were some that were made out of turtle shells that dancers would wear on their legs in order to create a rhythmic pattern with these rattles. This rattle has a hardwood handle wrapped in soft buckskin. The rawhide head is hand-laced and hand-painted. Brass tacks, such as these. Let's see, what are my brass tacks on here? Oh, literally, like these brass tacks, were actually traded throughout the country and would be traded amongst the tribes. There is an arrowhead, medicine wheel, and trade beads, which would have had significance and meaning to the owner. This is not a true spirit rattle because a true spirit rattle would actually have an eagle feather. This is a simulated feather, but in order to have the feather, you would have to be a person of great prominence within a tribe. But the spirits had to be invoked, and usually it was out of necessity. So rites and rituals were only really utilized when the natural order was not being met. And so that becomes very important. There is an awe or a fear of the dead, a certain order that should be met. Now, in addition to that, there's an awe to the supernatural. So there's a figure who wrote a book called The Golden Bough. His last name is Fraser, and he wrote this in the first half of the 20th century. I think my edition is from 1940, where he actually combines 2 volumes into one. But in this, he actually describes types of ritual which used to be seen as hoodoo or superstition, and he says, no, this is not superstition, this is actually ritual. So he classifies and quantifies it. The idea that he quantifies, he actually calls a category of this sympathetic magic. This means that if I do this, then that will happen. So if I wear this mask, I become the item that the mask represents. This is an Ashanti, this is a Maasai mask. If I want a child, I am going to carry with me an Ashanti doll, all right? It's dressed like a little girl. Daughters are very sacred, right? Because they are, of course, will grow to women to become life bearers. So if I want a daughter, if I want fertility, I will carry this item and treat it like a living child so that the universe will see what I need and will give me a living child. I probably shouldn't hold this too long because it definitely does incur fertility and yikes, no thank you, I've got the pups. So if I do this, that will happen. This comes in a couple of varieties. One is called productive magic. If I do this, then that will be produced. If I hold the Ashanti doll, a child will be produced. My fertility will increase, a child will be produced. So productive sympathetic magic or productive magic, and then the counter to that is a curse or a hex. And this is aversive magic, right? It's an adversary, it's an enemy. Sometimes there's a concept that says the universe only has so much beauty, health, and good fortune to give out. And you don't want to draw attention to it when you are having good fortune, because then the universe will look at you and say, oh yeah, that's an awful lot of good fortune for you. Let me take some of that back and redistribute it to somebody else. So you might actually have, this is something that happens like in old Eastern European worlds, where if you complimented a child, somebody would spit on the kid, because you wanted the universe to look away. If somebody saw what a beautiful child you had, they might take it away, right? So aversive magic is a curse or a hex. It is something to harm somebody else. In ancient Egypt, they used to carve sculptures of their enemies and put them in wells under rocks with the idea of drowning the enemy. That's aversive. So if I carve an image, and even though this is Aztec, we're just going to say, yeah, okay. If I carve this image and I put it in a well under a rock, and this image drowns, then so too will the image that it represents. The person that this represents will die as well. All right. So magic and the role of ritual becomes important. So with myth, there is ritual, and with ritual, there's expectation. If I do this and I do it correctly, then that should happen. This is all explained by the myth, all right, by the story of how this came to be. And we are going to talk about that a little bit more as we go. There is also a belief in manna. M-A-N-A, not two N's. M-A-N-N-A is the stuff in the desert in Judaism. M-A-N-A is a sacred power that can be taken from a person, place, or thing and transferred to another person, place, or thing. So in the West, one of the best examples of that, these are saint medallions that I was holding the last time I went to Rome to see the Pope, and he blessed the audience. Therefore, they are blessed, right? They are papally blessed. And of course, if the Pope in Catholicism represents the sacred world, then they are also a connection to Godhead. So by taking these, having them blessed, and by continuing to wear them, and these are the patron saints of the arts, because Lordy knows you cannot be too careful in the art world these days, then I am carrying that power. It is transferred to me. Another example is another necklace that I wear. This is boy, they're all twisted today, I'm sorry. This is a black opal. I just like black opals, but it turns out that the black opal wards the evil eye. So it wards off the evil eye. And the thing with the evil eye is when somebody gives it to you, it's because they covet something you have. So when they covet something you have and they give you this evil eye, they can actually cause damage not only to you, but also to your livestock. And in my case, that would be the pugs and the pets, and also to your crops, which I have a 10 by 10 tortoise garden that I really need to grow and flourish. So they can damage and spread that damage. So you wear the opal to ward that off, right? I'm prepared for when I converse with students and they're like, why did I get this grade? And I'm like, just kidding, I'm kidding. Anyway, you got to protect yourself, right? So the idea of mana, something that is able to be carried. In tribal traditions, for example, in Africa, there are certain tribes that believe if you kill an ape, you must eat its heart raw, because in eating the ape's heart, you are consuming its power, its strength, right? And it becomes part of you. Kind of an interesting element. There are also concepts of taboo. Ancient cultures have taboos. There are hunting taboos. There are menstruation taboos. There are food source taboos. Not preparing the food appropriately can be a problem. So invariably, every culture will break a taboo. And because of that, you have to have ritualized purification. So taboo produces spiritual pollution. Spiritual pollution pollutes you, the tribe, the people around you. It spreads. That's why it's a pollution. And when you are polluted and you pollute the tribe, then what does divinity do? Divinity withdraws from that pollution, right? There's a concept that divinity is pure. And when divinity withdraws from that pollution, divinity takes nature with it, and nature takes your food source. And now you are in some sort of trouble. So you have to have a purification ritual. In this case, the purification ritual is usually done by a shaman. Shaman are going to be highly important individuals. They are usually called. There may be a lineage. There may be a special mark. They may be physically different somehow, but they are going to be people who are unique. Now, a shaman has to be unique because they have to communicate with the spiritual world. They have more spiritual power than the average person because you have to communicate with the spiritual world in one of two ways. Either, as in Voodoo, allowing the spirit to possess your body, and if this happens, you have to have enough power to push that spirit back out and reclaim your body. So this is called a possession shaman. Or you have to be able to travel into the supernatural world to communicate with the spirits, or become literally a traveling shaman. If a shaman messes up, if the pollution is still there and nature continues to defy and remove itself from the tribe, then who gets the blame for that? It's the shaman. So if you mess up, you're in a lot of trouble. And I do remember reading some stories about Siberian shaman who were actually fleeing their tribe because there were an unusually high amount of stillbirths for the tribe, and his ritual did not stop the stillbirths. This was blamed on him not doing enough. Okay? All right. We're going to give you a lovely example of a shaman and their importance and how this entire system works with the story of the Inuit and their sea goddess Sedna. So the story is that in the very beginning, there was an early tribe, and Sedna was actually the daughter of a chieftain. As such, she was, she's, number one, she's a proto-human. So it's kind of like in the West where you have Adam and Eve, and Adam lives to be 900 years old and Eve lives to be 800 something. If you actually look at the Old Testament, you'll notice that the closer you are to God, the longer the lifespan. The further along humankind comes, the more sin that they have accrued, the shorter the lifespan, right? In this tradition, the closer to creation that you are, the more power that you have, the more unique that you are. So Sedna is kind of one of these proto-humans, and that'll be significant because essentially she is absolutely gorgeous. And Sedna, looks at herself every day and says, yes, I am it. She becomes old enough to marry, and her father says, who do you want to marry? And she says, oh gosh, Dad, I don't like any of these guys in the tribe. That one's too fat, that one's too short, that one's too thin, that one is this, he's not wealthy enough, he's got pockmarks, he's got buck teeth, and she just ruled them all out. Well, her father got really exasperated and said, well, honey, you really need to marry into the tribe. She says, oh, but Dad, look at this, they're not good enough. Until one day, who shows up on the shore but this magnificent man? And he's gorgeous, and he's got shining hair, and his bronze skin, shines, and he's got seal skins, and, seal skins being a sign of wealth. So he shows up, and he's got this pile of stuff with him, and she's like, ooh, Dad, that's the one. He's wealthy, he's gorgeous, he fits me perfectly. And her father's like, honey, you really should kind of stay connected to us. And she says, Dad, seriously, he's the one. So her father kind of reluctantly agrees, and she marries this beautiful stranger. Beautiful stranger says, okay, honey, it's time to go to my palace, and puts her in the canoe, and off they row. Well, lo and behold, they land in a faraway, distant place, and when she disembarks from the canoe, he takes her to his palace, and it turns out it's a giant nest. And there are no seal skins. There are only these flimsy little fish skins, which I can't even imagine, but meaning there's not this wealth. And she's looking around saying, wait, this is a nest. And he says, yeah, that's right, honey. And he unzips his human skin, and out steps, and even though this is African, we're just going to say, and out steps the crow, right, or the raven, the lord of the sky. And he's looking at her, and he says, well, honey, make yourself comfortable. And she says, wait, what? Right? And she's miserable because he only wanted her because she was pretty. If you ever look at ravens and crows, they collect pretty, shiny things. Well, she gets a message to her father, and she says, Dad, I need some help. And her father says, oh, honey, all right, I'll be there. And he rows over in his canoe while her husband is away ruling the sky. And he takes her out in the canoe. They row out to the middle of the ocean, and they start to talk. And she says, Dad, this guy isn't even human, and I can't believe it, and you've got to take me back. Well, right when Daddy's getting ready to respond, he looks up, and over her shoulder, he sees a flock of angry birds. Think Alfred Hitchcock. And they are coming right for them. And he goes, sorry, honey, you need to go back to your husband. Go back. And she says, no, I don't want to go back. And he says, you really and truly need to go back. And they begin to argue. And finally, she's arguing so much with her father, she stands up in the canoe, and over it tips. She falls into the water. Daddy manages to hold on. She swims up to the edge of the canoe, and she grabs onto it, and she says, Dad, let me in. And her father says, are you going to go back to your husband? And she says, no. And so he whacks her hands with the oars, and off pops the end digits of her fingers, and they fall into the water and they become seals. And she says, Dad, let me in the boat. And he says, are you going to go back to your husband? And she says, no. And so he whacks her hands again, and off go the middle digits, and they become walruses, and they swim away. She's still got her nubs, and she's holding on, and she says, Dad, let me back into the boat. And he says, are you going to go back to your husband? And she says, no. And so he whacks her hands again, and off pop the bottom digits, and they swim away as whales. And Sedna can no longer hold on, and so she sinks into the ocean. But unlike us, who would die, she's gone into the liminal state. She transforms into the goddess of the deep sea. And she and her father eventually make up. He built her a big castle because her husband says, oh, you're not the pretty shiny thing I got. You now have a flaw. And he doesn't want her back. And so she can never remarry, and she basically will end up dying as a spinster. So she has nothing better to do than stay in her castle that Daddy has built her. Well, in order to be entertained, Daddy also built her a tower, which she liked to climb up and spy on the people. So she kind of becomes that nosy neighbor lady that watches what you do. And she kind of watches the people, and when they start screwing up, like doing inappropriate sexual acts, or not preparing the food appropriately, or not behaving in the right manner, she says, that's it. They are terrible people. And she calls to her fingers the whales, the walruses, and the seals, and she brings them home, and she locks them in her castle. Well, now that's your food source. So far we've seen divinity, we've seen the origin of our food source, and now we see our food source being removed because we are breaking taboo. So, in order to purify the people, the shaman comes forth, and he gathers the people, and he makes them do a community confession. And once they do a community confession, he then says, I must go and alert the goddess so that she will take part in these purification rituals so that we can be friends again, and she'll send her food source back to me. And so he climbs down into a sacred tunnel. Right? He literally is a traveling shaman. The world opens up beneath him, and he just falls in, and he walks through, and he has to climb an immense wall, and he has to tame her dog, and he has to get into her castle, and then he has to find Sedna, and he has to calm her down. And so what he does is he combs her hair, right? And when he combs her hair, she begins to calm down, because remember, she has no fingers, so those are important. So once she calms down, he says, will you please listen to the people because we are so sorry? And she says, well, okay, I guess so. And so she takes part in the purification rituals. And when the rituals are done, she says, all right, you are again worthy of my support. And she sends out the food. She sends out the seals, whales, and walruses to sustain the tribes. All right, you with me so far? The interconnectedness, the role of pollution, sympathetic magic, the shaman, Sedna, look at all this good stuff. Okay, wow, we've covered a lot of notes. Hold on here, let me look at the next one. Oh, the totemic. All right. So there's another concept to consider, and that's where this comes in. This is, of course, a totem pole representative of the totemic. Now, I always find this interesting because you have air, land, and water, right? This is kind of the indigenous culture triad. The sky, the land, the water. And of course you have figures like frogs who are very transformative, who go from being completely in the water to being in the water and on the land. And birds who go from the air to the top of the land, if you will, the trees. And then bears kind of being in the middle, right? The totemic animal, the sacred animal. So the totemic basically means if I live in nature, and nature has a soul and spirit, if I kill anything in nature, I am committing a crime, and that crime is what? That crime is murder. And so ultimately, we have to have a connection or a deal with nature. Now, this comes in two different types. One type is you make a deal with nature and you make a totemic friend who agrees to become your food source because it's mutually beneficial. The other kind of totemic is a sacred being, like magpie that we're going to talk about, who basically is not killed. He is a sacred part of your spiritual life, and therefore is protected. Not only does this engage animals, it also engages sacred food, right? So for example, in Mexico, there's a wonderful story of a young man who is kind of he's a late menopause baby, if you will. His parents are very old when they finally have him. And when he's about 12 years old, his father is too old to hunt. And this is kind of a problem because if daddy can't hunt, they're not going to eat. And so the young boy is very pious and he prays to the gods and he says, please, please help us. My family is good and we deserve to live. And the gods answer and they say, okay, here's what we're going to do. You will come across a warrior dressed in white and he will challenge you to wrestle him. You shall wrestle him 3 times. And if you win, and technically inserted is not if, it's when you win, you shall cut off his head and bury it into the ground, and we will take care of you. So indeed, this is what takes place. The boy meets the wrestler, he wrestles and wins 3 times, and of course you have to understand this is a 12-year-old kid versus a full-grown, handsome, gorgeous wrestling man. So divinity has some mercy, and in so doing, when the boy cuts off the warrior's head and he plants it into the earth, what should grow from it but corn? And of course, corn becomes a sustainer for the people, right? The story that we're going to talk about when it comes to the other types of totemic animals in particular is the story of Minnehaha, which is not only an awesome name, but Minnehaha is it's a lot of fun to say, but it's a great story that tells us about 2 totemic animals. So let's just do it. So this is from the Sioux or the Blackfoot tribe, and the story is that Minnehaha was the daughter of a chief. So once again, we have a princess figure. And one day, basically what the tribe would do is winter came, they would round up the buffalo and they'd run at them and they'd get them to jump off a cliff and hit the ground and die. And then they would prepare the buffalo hides and they prepare the meat. They would do like buffalo jerky and they would survive the winter. Well, one year they go after the buffalo herd and the herd gets to the edge and they're like, nah, and they turn. And no matter what the tribe does, they can't get these buffalo to jump. And they are tremendously upset because this is starvation for the winter. So they hold a tribal council, and Minnehaha's father, of course, is part of this tribe and this council, and this goes on for a while, and he finally turns to his daughter and he says, sweetie, go down to the river and get us some water. Now remember that water is kind of a liminal state in and of itself. It represents marriage in Judaism. It represents kind of a meeting of lands. It's a connector between the living and the dead. Yeah, so it's really cool. But anyway, so she goes down to the river, and it's kind of in a valley, and she's looking up at all the bison, and she says, oh gosh, if only you would jump, I would marry one of you. And this is kind of one of those things, again, that you just don't expect somebody to do. But all of a sudden it's raining bison, and she's like, what in the world is going on? Well, the jumping stops and the remaining bison come together and they follow behind a beautiful white buffalo. And he comes down and he says, hi, I'm the buffalo shaman. Ooh, even animals have these. And you are going to marry me. And she says, wait, what? And he said, well, he said if we jumped, you'd marry one of us. And, that's my great Uncle Bob over there who's dead, and that's Aunt Gertrude, and that's Cousin Joe, and they all jumped. So we held up our end, and now it's time for you to uphold yours. And she doesn't quite know what to do, so she doesn't feel like she has a choice, and she ends up going off with the buffalo. Well, her father's like, tick-tock, tick-tock, where's my kid? And he goes out and he follows her footsteps and he sees the dead buffalo, and then he sees the herd, the remaining hoof prints going off, and amongst these he sees a girl's footprints, and he's like, oh man, my daughter ran off with the buffalo. I need to go and get her back. And so he follows these footsteps. Well, lo and behold, As time goes on, Daddy gets really tired and he sits down and he's kind of resting his feet at a spot called the Buffalo Wallow, which is where the buffalo go to roll off their fleas and ticks and lice. Fun times. I don't think I'd sit there, but I'm not in this myth. And ultimately, while he's sitting there, Magpie, so our beautiful bird figure once again, lands next to him and says, "So what's up?" And he says, "Oh, Magpie, my daughter has run off with the buffalo." Now, before I forget, magpie are going to be fairly significant because not only are they highly intelligent tool users, but they're a relative of the raven and the crow, and these are going to be significant animals because they reflect the light, they glow and they shimmer, and they look otherworldly. So this is a spiritual totem, right? A spiritual totemic being. And Magpie says, "I've got you, Chief. I will go and see if I can find her." And off he flies, and he says, "Oh, look, there's a buffalo herd. Oh, there's a girl." And he goes down and he lands, and he says, "Minnehaha, your father's waiting for you." And Minnehaha says, "Oh my gosh, Magpie, go back and tell him to wait. I will have to meet with him because the buffalo are really, really upset, and I think they'll kill him if they find him." So Magpie goes back and relays the message, and of course Daddy's like, "Really?" But he sits and waits. And right at that moment, Minnehaha's husband comes up and he pops off a horn and he hands it to her and he says, "Go get me some water." So you've got to know, again, a meeting between worlds. And so off she goes. And on the way down to the river, she sees her father and she stops and she talks to him and she says, "Dad, you need to let me work it out." And Dad says, "Well, I'm not leaving until you come with me, so hurry up." You know, she's like, "Oh gosh, more pressure." But she scoops up the water and she heads back to her husband. And when she gets there, her husband takes the water and prepares to drink it. And then he goes, "You have been talking to another human. I can smell him." And so he says, "Troops, come together now." And they follow her footsteps. I'm like, dang, she must have size 10 feet, but okay. Follow her footsteps back to Daddy, who's waiting, and the buffalo are enraged, and they stomp on him until he is decimated, and he's nothing but dust. And Minnehaha begins to weep, and her husband looks at her and says, "Why are you crying? We die all the time for you, and you don't weep for us." But ladies, if you have to get married to a buffalo, try to marry one that's like this guy, who is a compassionate buffalo shaman. And he says, "But I tell you what, if you can bring your father back to life, we'll annul this whole thing." And so she says, "Okay." And because she's an early human, she's got powers. She's a female, right? Women are the duality between life and death. They bring birth, and in bringing birth, they also bring death, right? So she's got those two elements. And then there's even this idea of incarnation again, life after death that comes through the woman with rebirth, right? So she says, okay, and she makes a blanket and she says, "Magpie, I need some help. I've got to find something in my father that I can use." And Magpie looks around and he finds a little tiny piece of a vertebrae. And she says, "Oh, that's perfect." And she puts it under the blanket. And she begins to sing a song, and lo and behold, her father's body reforms. But it's young and beautiful again. And she sings a few more bars, and not only does her father reform, he stands up and he is alive again. And the buffalo are stunned and they say, wait, if you've been able to do this, why aren't you doing this for us? If we agree to die for you, we want you to perform this ritual every year and bring us back in powerful new forms. And so what ends up evolving is something called the buffalo dance. In return for killing and eating the buffalo, we have this agreement, so it's not necessarily murder here. We are going to thank the buffalo for their sacrifice. We're going to save a vertebra, a piece of the buffalo. Every spring, we are going to do a ritual in which we honor the buffalo and we allow their souls to come back to be reborn in strong, new, young bodies. And of course, it's no coincidence this takes place in the spring, the birthing season, right? And so they become part of that cycle of life and death. Pretty cool. All right, let's see if there's other stuff. Magpie. Oh, wow, look at us. We're like totally nailing these notes. Ooh. Oh, yeah, archetype. Okay. And look at that. That's the end of your notes. Yay. So there's one other concept here. I gotta move this toggle back. And this concept is of what do we do about eternity, right? In Hinduism, we have this idea that we come from the eternal God, we live and we go through these cycles, and we return to the eternal God. Buddhism, we have this omnipotence that we can achieve, and then we control our incarnations throughout existence. In the West, we say, I'm born, I die, and then boom, afterlife, eternal, right? We don't hear a lot of that here in the tribal traditions. So how do we find connectedness and eternity in these tribes? Well, it is through something called an archetype. Now, there are a couple different concepts of archetype. One comes from Joseph Campbell, the story, for example, of monomyth, that there are 7 different types of figures that we find in most stories, such as the mentor, the hero, the villain, threshold guardians, or the minions, right? The shapeshifter, somebody who either literally shapeshifts or who transforms somehow. You have a trickster figure, and by the way, in most of these cultures, you have to have a trickster, because the trickster, like Loki, if you are familiar with the Avengers, of course they stole that whole idea from the Nordic indigenous religions, haha. But Loki is necessary. There's a reason why he's not destroyed. He is necessary because he can go around the typical rules and restart things. So he becomes a component of necessity. Anansi, right, the trickster spider in Africa, they seem cruel. The coyote, another one, seems cruel or unpredictable, but while they are unpredictable, they are also moving and pushing the world forward in a way that no one else can. Okay? So you have that type of archetype. The other type of archetype is a conceptual archetype. The idea that how do I find my divinity? This is from Victorian Falls in Africa, and I just think it's kind of an interesting abstracted male figure. But how do I find my interconnectivity? If you are male and your tribe happens to hunt, your great-grandfather hunted, your great-grandfather hunted, your grandfather hunted, your father hunted, you hunt, your son will hunt, your grandson will hunt, your great-great-grandson will hunt. While you are actually hunting, the hunt, number one, becomes a ritual. And I think that's a big difference between the East and the West, because in the West it's sport, but in the East, in the indigenous cultures, it is a ritual. You prepare yourself. In Florida, before you went out on the hunt, the Ayas tribe in kind of South Florida, they would have to purify themselves by drinking. It's kind of a hybrid of tea and coffee. It's an offshoot of coffee, essentially. And they would drink down massive amounts of this caffeinated drink, and they'd have to either hold it in their stomachs so that they sweated, and the sweat was purifying, or they would cleanse themselves internally by puking this stuff forward. And of course, the most masculine guy was the one who could puke the furthest, but we're just going to say, okay. So, you prepared for this. It was a ritual. So it was sacred. And when you engaged in the hunt, you engaged in what all of the prior generations did and what all the future generations will do. And in that moment, you have achieved the archetype. You have connected to the eternal. Well, what if you're female? And I like this figure as well. This was from my father, who went to Australia, and this is an Aboriginal Australian female. Notice what's really emphasized on this figure, right? So essentially, if you are female, what is your archetype? Well, ladies, it's childbirth. So in becoming pregnant, right, and actually in achieving your first menses, the menses is going to be very significant in a lot of these tribes. And in fact, I always love it because in some tribes, you would wear your menstrual blood and you'd be paraded through town, and you would get a special meal, and you would be celebrated for your first menstrual cycle because it meant you were a woman, right? And look at how different it is in the West, where Judaism says, you, right? Mikvah, you need to go bathe, purify yourself, right? but menstruation, pregnancy, and the true archetype, childbirth. Yay, right? The thing that you're wired to forget because it's so freaking painful that you'd stop after one. That's great. But how did she get here? Her mother gave birth. How did her mother get here? Her mother gave birth. Her mother gave birth. Her mother gave birth. The daughter that she has will give birth, who will give birth and birth and birth. And so for the feminine, the archetype is the sacredness of life-bearing, right? Pretty cool. So, whew, that was a lot to talk about. I almost showed you all my little goodies. The only thing I don't think I quite got to were the kachinas. These are from the Hopi, and these are spirits of nature that come down. The kachina doll was devised as a teaching tool given to Pueblo children as part of their cultural and religious training. It is estimated that there are more than 250 different kachinas, with several new additions added periodically. Each kachina had a specific function and is believed to be the spirit of an animal, bird, plant, object, place, or person. The ancestral kachinas were benevolent entities who once lived among people to teach basic living skills such as hunting, tool making, and healing. Some kachinas instructed on maintaining and restoring harmony, and this has a certificate of authenticity. This, I believe, is a ancestor, whereas this one is a wolf or coyote kachina, right? And there's kind of an interesting story in the in the northwestern tribes about coyote. And I've always found this to be kind of interesting, just to kind of give you this idea. But there was a time in which the men of a tribe could not impregnate their women, and this meant that the tribe was going to die. And an old man showed up and said, if the women go to a sacred tree and they straddle a certain branch, they will bear children. And of course, he was seen as this mystic figure. And so the tribe was like, oh yeah, let's send the women out and let them do this ritual. This is where it gets to be kind of interesting. Coyote himself was that old man, and Coyote himself went to that sacred tree that he pointed out, and Coyote carved a hole in the tree, and then he climbed inside the trunk, and he stuck out a very significant male appendage as a branch. And so, of course, when the women straddled it, of course they became pregnant. But the idea is that as a trickster, right, he gets the tribe moving again in more ways than one. But he actually brings in sacred blood to the tribe, and he brings the tribe back from the brink of extinction by being a trickster. I mean, there's fun. I mean, anyway. There's a lot of these wonderful, wonderful stories out there. So I really hope that this kind of gives you a little flavor. I hope this also helps you. And so at this point, I am going to say hasta la vista. I will check with you all later. If you have any questions, let me know. Make sure you are keeping up with the classwork, and we'll touch base. Take care.